Let's begin with prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for this day of rest that you've given to us. We ask that you would help us to worship you and to learn more about you as we study your word. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. We've arrived at Exodus 20, and that's where the Ten Commandments are found. And this really starts the second part of our study in Exodus. I think that if we do all of Exodus, it'll break up into either 3 or 4 sections. One, the history that we've considered up to this point, and then the Ten Commandments, which I think it might be good for us to spend a little time on and look at them in their historical context. Usually the Ten Commandments are preached as the moral law, and we don't often look at them and say, why did God give these laws to this people at this time? Why didn't He give the Ten Commandments to Abraham? How do they relate to the history that we've looked at? And so we might want to do some of that. And then the next block of material is the amplifying laws, the smaller laws of Exodus 21 to 23. And then the last block of material in Exodus is the laws describing the house of God. And all of these things fit together, and we'll look at that as we go. But today we've arrived at the Ten Commandments. We've been slowly approaching Mount Sinai, and we got there a couple of weeks ago, and now God begins to speak. And if you look at your notes, I think the first thing I want to do is contextualize this by pointing out that God Himself spoke this. And if you look at chapter 19, verse 16, it says, "It came about on the third day, when it was morning, that there were thunder and lightning flashes, a thick cloud upon the mountain, and a very loud trumpet sound, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled." Now, what you don't see, unless you have some other kind of translation, maybe, is the word thunder there is just the word voice. It's kind of a generic Hebrew word that as often as not means voice or sound. So we could read it, "It came about on the third day when it was morning, there was a voice and lightning flashes." Now, surely it sounded like thunder, but there seems to be a reason why the word voice is used here. And if we look at John chapter 12, we see a New Testament instance of the same phenomenon. John 12, 28 and 29, Jesus says, "Father, glorify thy name. There came therefore a voice out of heaven, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. The multitude therefore who stood by and heard it were saying that it had thundered. Others were saying, an angel has spoken to him." So when God speaks from heaven, it sounds like thunder to those whose ears are not attuned. And I think the reason that the word voice is used here in verse 16 of Exodus 19 is that, yes, it sounded like thunder to the people, but it was actually also the voice of God, or the voice of the cherubim, reflecting the voice of God. Look at verse 19 of Exodus 19. "When the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him with a voice." It says God answered him with thunder, but you see, the voice implication is there as well. Then chapter 20, verse 1, we read, "God spoke all these words, saying." But by now we ought to be able to see that God thundered all these words as well. That's what His voice was like. In chapter 20, verse 18, the last verse, after God says the Ten Commandments and ends them in verse 17, all the people perceived the thunder and the lightning flashes. All the people perceived the voice and the lightning flashes and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. When the people saw it, they trembled and stood at a distance. So the voice of God comes like thunder and thunders these Ten Commandments to the people. And that's designed to produce a certain kind of response. Now, the effect of this is that the people were afraid. Look at chapter 20, because that's really where we are. We'll see chapter 20, God spoke all these words saying, or God thundered all these words. That's not a translation now. It says God spoke saying, but we've found out that His voice is like thunder. So in English we could even say, paraphrase it by saying God thundered all these words saying, and then the Ten Commandments are given. And then verse 18, at the end, when they saw all this, they trembled and stood at a distance. Verse 20, Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid, for God has come in order to test you, and in order that the fear of Him may remain with you, so that you may not sin." Do you see a superficial contradiction in that verse? Exodus 20, verse 20. What's the contradiction there? Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid, for God has come in order to test you, in order that the fear of Him may remain with you."
Not be afraid and fear remain.
Yes. Now that apparent contradiction would be as obvious to them in the ancient world as it is to us today. Do not be afraid, because God has come to make you afraid. Now how do we understand that? Well, we have to understand it in terms of a distinction between two kinds of fear. And even though the same word's used, it's obvious that two different kinds of fear are involved. There's the kind of fear that causes people to flee and run away, and then there's the kind of fear that doesn't cause people to flee and run away, but does leave them in a state of awe. And Moses says, don't be afraid in such a way that you run and hide, but do be afraid because you're children and this is your Father. And just as it's appropriate from time to time, not every day of course, but from time to time for parents to thunder at their children, at least if God thunders at His children, then it's okay for us to thunder at ours if necessary, because children should have a certain amount of fear. And citizens should have a certain amount of fear. If you're driving down the highway at 75 miles an hour and you see a car coming up behind you with a little dome on the top, you have instant fear. And you slow down to 65. That's involved here. And that's because in back of that is the siren and the potential of thundering you into a $100 fine or something. And all the emotional headache of being pulled off the side and not being able to get your heart quieted down for an hour afterwards and having to think about it for 2 days until it finally goes out of your mind. Nobody wants to go through that. So you perceive the thunder and you're afraid. But it doesn't mean you don't drive your car anymore. It sets up a boundary. So God thunders at them so that they will be afraid, but not the fear that causes you to depart altogether, but a fear that enables you to stay but understand what the rules are. So that's one effect of the voice of God and the way the Ten Commandments are given. A true and proper fear. I think it's useful for us as Calvinists to think about this because the Lutheran type of theology, and this is very popular in evangelicalism, says that the law comes and then the gospel comes. It's called law, gospel, or law, grace approach to the Bible. First God gives the law and it condemns people, and then they come into the kingdom and they have grace and they're free from the law. Now there is a sense in which the law does condemn people and drive them to the cross. But when the law is given in the Bible, it's always given in a context of people already being saved. These people have already been saved. They've been taken out of Egypt. The Passover blood has been shed. And the law is given to them in a context when they're already saved as a way of life. So in our worship service, we don't read the law of God and then have a confession of sin. Now that is the Lutheran way of doing a liturgy. And the Lutheran type of liturgy, although modern Lutherans don't do this anymore, they're more reformed. But the old Lutheran way of doing the liturgy, and the evangelicals will do this, read the Ten Commandments and then they'll have a confession of sin. Well, that's not how it works in the Bible. You confess your sin, you come into the kingdom, and then you hear the Ten Commandments. Now, there is a fear that's involved here, but it's not the fear that says, you're afraid, you got to confess your sin and come to Jesus. It's the fear that says, I'm in the kingdom, I understand where the boundaries are, I may be chastised if I break the law. See, there's a different kind of fear. Our approach to theology is grace and then law, gospel and then law. God recreates us and then He tells us what to do. That's the emphasis in Reformed theology. And that's what we see here. They're already saved and they're given the law, and the law is fearful. But they're not given this thundering, fearful law in order to drive them to the cross. They're just given this thundering, fearful law to remind them of the boundaries of morality. So I hope that you get a handle on that, and I'll repeat it enough as we look at this over the next several weeks, and it comes up in Romans as well. So we'll bear this in mind. The second effect of this thundering of the voice of God, the way the Ten Commandments are given, is it shows them the need for a mediator. Look back at Exodus 19:9. We pointed this out before, but we'll remind it today. Exodus 19, verse 9. Yahweh said to Moses, Behold, I shall come to you in a thick cloud, in order that the people may hear when I speak with you, and may believe in you forever. God says, I'll come in a thick cloud, I'll come with all this drama and fearfulness, I will thunder out these words, in order that the people may believe in Moses. Now, why is that important? Anybody remember? Moses is going to go up to the top of the mountain and be given all this information. Stuff like, if you work on the Sabbath day, you're to be put to death. Stuff like, you will not suffer a witch to live. Stuff like, build this tabernacle and Bezaleel is going to be in charge of it. And that means the other 1,999,999 people are not going to be in charge of it. Bezaleel is. Aaron's going to be the high priest. That means that all the Korahites and all the others who would like to be high priests are not going to be. Moses is going to come down the mountain with all this information. My brother Aaron will be the high priest of the nation. You think they would likely believe all this? Looks like Moses just got up there and invented a system where he would be in charge and his brother would be the high priest and his buddy Bezaleel would build the tabernacle and get all the glory, and his buddy Joshua would get to be the commander of the armies, and anybody who disagreed with him would be put to death. You can see him saying that about Moses. But now God has established, you see, Moses. They beg Moses to be the one to go up on the mountain and get the information. Oh, please, Moses, we don't want to listen to it anymore. It's shattering our nerves to listen to this thundering. And so by doing it this way, God establishes in the people's minds that they need to have Moses be the one to get the word and bring it down to them. And so God says in Exodus 19, verse 9, that He's going to do this. And in chapter 20, verses 19 and 21, when the people perceive all this, then they said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen, but let not God speak to us, lest we die." And Moses said to the people, "Don't be afraid. God has come in order to test you, in order that the fear of Him may remain with you, so that you may not sin." And the people stood at a distance while Moses approached the thick cloud where God was. So Moses becomes the mediator. And we need a mediator. We need somebody to bring the Word of God to us. And Moses is a type of Christ in that regard. Now, I also want to call your attention to Hebrews chapter 12. Because we might be inclined to think, well, God thundered back then, and it was fearful back then, but not anymore. But that's not what the New Testament says. So look for a few minutes at Hebrews 12, starting in verse 18. I know you've read this passage before, but let's just read it again in this context. Hebrews 12:18. He says to the church, "You have not come to," then he lists 7 things here. First of all, a mountain that may be touched. Second, a blazing fire. Third, darkness. 4, gloom. 5, a whirlwind. 6, the blast of a trumpet. And 7, the sound of words. There's that thunder voice sound thing again. The sound of words, which was such that those who begged that no further word should be spoken to them. For they could not bear the command, "If even a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned." And so terrible was the sight that even Moses said, "I am full of fear and trembling." Now Moses says that in Deuteronomy 9:19. But the idea is that even Moses says, "I am full of fear and trembling." That's how amazing it was. But remember that on the day of Pentecost in Acts 2, we have all this same phenomena. Wind, thunder, earthquake, all the rest. When God comes in His chariot, that's what it's like. But now he says, by way of contrast, he lists 8 things here. "You have come to Mount Zion," that's 1, and 2, to the city of the living God, 3, which is the heavenly Jerusalem, 3, myriads of angels in festal array, and that really carries us into verse 23, 4, the church of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, 5, God, the judge of all, 6, the spirits of righteous men made perfect, 7, Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and 8, to the sprinkled blood which speaks better than the blood of Abel. That's the new covenant. We move from 7 to 8. All these great things we've come to, which he says are somehow equivalent to the phenomena that happened at Mount Sinai. Now, it might be interesting to sit down and try to draw all that out, but here, that's what we've come to. But then notice that the implication of it is, it's not that, oh well, it's all love now and no fear. See to it, verse 25, that you do not refuse him who is speaking. For if those did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, much less shall we escape who turn away from him who warns from heaven. What happened to that generation of people who were at Mount Sinai? Almost all of them died in the wilderness because they refused him who warned them on earth. They did not listen to Moses. But now Jesus has gone to heaven, and he's written these letters here, like Hebrews, and he warns from heaven, that's more fearful. Verse 26, his voice shook the earth then, but now he has promised, and in the translation here needs help, but literally it says, yet in a little while I will be shaking not only the earth but also the heaven. And this expression, yet in a little while, denotes the removing of those things that can be shaken, as of created things, in order that those things that cannot be shaken may remain. So it's not just Mount Sinai that's going to shake now, it's the whole earth. All the old world will shake, and will shake the righteous into the church and the wicked into hell. Therefore, since we receive a kingdom that cannot be shaken, that's the church, you're secure there, let us show thankfulness, by which we may offer to God an acceptable service with reverence and fear, for God is a consuming fire. So you see the idea of fear. He says it is involved in worship, what we do today, offering to God an acceptable service. It's involved in all of life. So it's a characteristic. We haven't moved away from the fearfulness of God's words. But it's not a fearfulness that leads to terror. It's a fearfulness that makes us understand the boundaries of life. If anything, God is drawn nearer in the New Testament, and we should be more aware of the danger of apostasy now than they were then. Because remember, that's what Hebrews is all about, the danger of falling away. Well, do any of you have any questions about this kind of context that we've set up for the Ten Commandments now? The voice of God, the thunder, and all the rest, or anything preceding weeks, because now we'll start talking about the Ten Commandments. Switch gears a bit. The Decalogue is the Ten Commandments. We'll follow these notes here. The Ten Commandments we need to say two things about to start with. One is that the Decalogue has a general character, which is that its importance and centrality for all time in the church. It's in a sense timeless, permanent. And we recognize that. The church always has. But at the same time, there is a specific character to the Decalogue, which is that it was given in the Old Covenant to Israel at a particular time in Israel's history when she was formed into a nation. And the way the Ten Commandments are phrased reflects that. And so we have to do justice to both the general and the specific aspects of it if we're to interpret it rightly and understand it rightly. The church has always recognized the centrality of the Ten Commandments. Starting in the earliest times, catechisms were built around three statements: the Nicene Creed, the Ten Commandments, and the Lord's Prayer. And if you look at the Westminster Shorter Catechism and Larger Catechism, you'll find that the first section is about doctrine, which is the formal equivalent of the Nicene or Apostles' Creeds. Then there's an exposition of the Ten Commandments, and then there's an exposition of the Lord's Prayer. And that comes right out of the Middle Ages, except that sometimes in the Middle Ages they also had an exposition of the Ave Maria, which of course we wouldn't have. But the Heidelberg Catechism is set up that way, and that's the way catechizing was done. So the Ten Commandments are viewed as a summary of the moral law. Not only that, but they were recognized by the church in that they were put into the liturgy. Many of the traditional liturgies use the Ten Commandments. The Book of Common Prayer in its communion service requires that the Ten Commandments be read, and the congregation say amen after each one of them. After each of the Ten Commandments, the congregation says, Lord, incline our hearts to keep your holy law. And similarly, many Reformed churches have used the Ten Commandments week by week or once a month in the liturgy. So the church has always recognized its importance. And this draws from the fact that the Ten Commandments were given in a unique occasion. This is the time when God draws near with all these phenomena. This is the only time that the entire Israelite nation was together in one place. Men, women, children, sojourners, all of them. It is the time when Israel was constituted as a nation. It's the day of assembly, as the Bible puts it. It's unique. It's unique in the history of the world. You get to the New Testament, there is no time when all the believers in the world are together in one place, or even all the churches. Well, you could say the day of Pentecost. All those who were being baptized with New Testament baptism were in one place. But it kind of instantly spread out to all these people who were other places. But at this time, everybody was there. There were even people like Jethro representing the nations who were there, who were not Jews, not Israelites, but were Gentile believers. So it's a unique occasion. It's unique in that God spoke it out loud to all the people not just to a prophet. There's all kinds of red letter stuff in the Old Testament that God speaks. Of course, red letter Bibles, when I was coming along, they were regarded as liberal and heretical, because the implication of a red letter Bible is that things Jesus says are more inspired than the rest. But if they were consistent with that, they would understand that Jesus is the incarnation of Yahweh in the Old Testament, and all the stuff that Yahweh says in the Old Testament would be in red letters too, which would be an awful lot of the Old Testament. An awful lot of Isaiah and Jeremiah and these other books. Isaiah says, the Lord said to me such and such, and then there are 4 or 5 chapters of what the Lord said to him to pass on to the people. But on this occasion, the 10 Commandments are said not to a prophet to pass on to somebody else, which is what the whole book of Leviticus is. The whole book of Leviticus, God says to Moses, and Moses passes it on. Here, God speaks to everybody. That's unique. So this is a unique occasion, and the 10 Commandments are given special status by this. See, the 10 Commandments were written with God's finger on stone. I believe it's in chapter 31 that we're told that. I didn't write it down, but see if we can find it real quick. Yes, chapter 31, verse 18. When God had finished speaking with Moses on Mount Sinai, He gave Moses the 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone, written by the finger of God. Then Moses broke these when the people broke the covenant. Then God did them again. Exodus 34, verse 28. Moses went back up, and he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He did not eat bread or drink water. And God wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. So, these permanent tablets with the 10 Commandments were written by God Himself. That's pretty rare. Belshazzar's feast, Daniel and Belshazzar saw a form of a hand writing on the wall, but that doesn't quite have the same status as this. This is permanent. God didn't write anything else. People took down what God says. The book of Leviticus wasn't written by God's finger. God dictated it to Moses, and Moses wrote it down. So this is unique. The 10 Commandments are put inside the Ark of the Covenant. Now the Ark, we'll have to look at the Ark later on, but the Ark of the Covenant represents the human being. It's an altar. You know it's an altar because the Shekinah glory fire was above it and blood was put on it. And it represents a human being. And the 10 Commandments inside here, those represent the law written on the heart. And so writing the law on these stones, and remember that human beings are made of earth, they're made of stone, means that they're written on the heart. And Moses himself later on says this law is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. In fact, we looked at that last time. It's over in Deuteronomy. So the 10 Commandments were the sum of God's design for human character. The rest of the law is not written on stones to symbolize being written on the heart. Of course, the rest of the law amplifies and explains the 10 Commandments, and so it is written on the heart in that sense. But the 10 Commandments are central. They're put in the central place in the tabernacle. They're written in such a way as to indicate that they're on your heart. And so they are the sum of God's design for human character. What is a human being supposed to be like? He's supposed to be like the 10 Commandments. Because that's what God's like. God doesn't steal. God doesn't lie. God is not unfaithful. God doesn't covet what other people have. God rests on the 7th day. God doesn't worship any other gods. God communicates with Himself properly. These are the things that God is like. They're the things the image of God is like, and they sum it up. Finally, the importance and centrality of the 10 Commandments is seen that it's used in the Bible numerous places as a summary of God's requirements. The Bible itself uses it this way. Like in Deuteronomy 5, we'll come back to this, but in Deuteronomy 5, Moses, when he starts to rehearse the law with the people of God and adds all kinds of new things to them under divine inspiration that they're supposed to think about as they go into the land, the first thing he does is he repeats the 10 Commandments, but he makes a few changes in them, which is important because it indicates that the basic principles are applied differently in different times. Moses repeats the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy 5. Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7, is in many ways a commentary on the 10 Commandments. Jesus goes through them very quickly. Matthew 19:16-19. You know these passages because you know the New Testament well, but just let me remind you how Jesus uses the 10 Commandments. Matthew 19:16-19. One came to Him and said, "Teacher, what good thing shall I do that I may obtain eternal life?" He said to him, "Why are you asking me about what's good? There's only one who is good. But if you wish to enter into life, keep the commandments." Well, that's true. This is not some kind of trick where Jesus says, well, if you want to be saved, keep the commandments, and then you try, and then you realize you can't do it, so then you got to have faith. No, the commandments start off with, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Trust me. So the very first of the commandments is the commandment to have faith. If you want to enter into life, keep the true, holistic meaning of the commandments, which involves faith, faithfulness. And he said to Jesus, which ones? And Jesus said, well, thou shalt not commit murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, honor thy father and thy mother, love thy neighbor as thyself. Well, love thy neighbor as thyself isn't in the Ten Commandments, but it sums up the second half. You see what Jesus does? He rehearses the Ten Commandments with this man. And then also in Romans 13, verse 9, Paul does it. Paul in Romans 13, verse 8 and 9. My apologies to those of you joining us by the miracle of cassette tape. However, the second side of the lecture was not recorded because the tape recorder was not set the proper way. However, I have gone over all the material that was covered in the few minutes remaining on this lecture at the beginning of the next tape. So if you want to continue the thoughts, just go right on to the next tape and you'll find a review of what's on this tape, as well as a detailed continuation that starts up almost exactly the point that this tape gives out. We were going to read Romans 13:9, where we would find a list of the Ten Commandments, or many of them, and then we were going to glance at Ephesians 4:25 to 6 verse 9, which again touches on the Ten Commandments. I think if you take these passages and read them yourself, you'll see right away that in both cases, in Romans 13:9, Paul very briefly touches on them, and then in Ephesians 4:25 to 6 verse 9, he hits all of them except the Sabbath commandment, one way or the other.